like radio and television transmitters, cell phones and microwave ovens. The process of establishing guidelines is first to identify scientific data on the effects of exposure, and from these data we determine effects that are considered both adverse to humans and that are scientifically substantiated, which means that there's enough scientific evidence to establish that the effects are real. The next step is to identify the minimum exposure level that is needed to produce harm in humans, and to that exposure level we apply reduction factors, and these are larger for the general public than for workers. This results then in exposure restrictions with a large margin of safety, which means that if the exposure restrictions are exceeded to a certain extent, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's immediate health risk. There are two types of restrictions. The first type are the basic restrictions, and these refer to fields in people, but these fields cannot be measured easily. Therefore, we have derived reference levels from the basic restrictions, and these reference levels refer to fields in the environment, and these can be measured rather easily. And these reference levels are typically used to ensure safety. The scientific basis for the guidelines are first of all major reviews from international organizations, as well as original papers that have not been included in these reviews. The only adverse health effects that have been identified from these reviews and papers are nerve stimulation, which is an effect that occurs up to 10 MHz, and the limits for these are included in the guidelines that have been published in 2010. And the other effect is heating, and that is an effect that occurs from frequencies up to over 100 kHz. There is no evidence from all these scientific information for the induction of cancer by radiofrequency fields, for electrohypersensitivity, for infertility and for other health effects. The adverse health effects that have been identified are first of all a deep body temperature increase of more than 1 degree centigrade. If that occurs, that may lead to adverse health. And second, a tissue temperature of over 41 degrees centigrade. We use different quantities to estimate the temperature or the temperature increase, and these quantities depend on the frequency or the duration of the exposure. For example, for local exposures, the absorbed energy rate, the SAR, specific absorption rate, is used at lower frequencies, and power density is used at higher frequencies. Altogether, it's a rather complex system, but that is needed to assess the health effects. This table gives an overview of the basic restrictions for the entire frequency range. For instance, if you look here, you see the core temperature, and the increase that is allowed is 1 degree centigrade, and that's established over the whole body. The temporal averaging time is 30 minutes, and the health effect level for that endpoint is 4 watts per kilogram. So an SAR of 4 watts per kilogram should not be exceeded. If we then apply a reduction factor of 10 for workers, we end up with an exposure level, a maximum exposure level of 0.4 watts per kilogram. A reduction factor of 50 for the general public gives us an exposure level of 0.8 watts per kilogram. For local exposures of the head and torso, which are for frequencies from 100 kHz up to 6 GHz, the temperature increase allowed is 2 degrees centigrade for local tissues, over 10 grams of tissue and over 6 minutes. The health effect level is an SAR of 20 watts per kilogram, but applying the reduction factors for workers, we end up with 10 watts per kilogram exposure level, and for the general public, a reduction factor of 10 is applied, which leads to 2 watts per kilogram, and that is an SAR value that, for instance, applies to the use of mobile telephones. For the limbs, we have higher exposure levels, because there the temperature increase can be a little bit higher, 5 degrees centigrade. And for the frequency range of 6 GHz up to 300 GHz, also 5 degrees centigrade is allowed, but here the power density is the basic restriction, and you can see here the numbers for that. This slide gives an overview of some of the reference levels. A number of different types of reference levels are provided. These reference levels apply to the general public exposure. For whole body exposures more than 6 minutes. You can see the red line, which are the 1998 basic restrictions. The blue line are the basic restrictions in terms of the electric field that are provided in these new guidelines. The green line are the reference levels from the 2010 guidelines for lower frequencies, and you can see that where they intersect, that in this area the restrictions are a little bit higher than in the 1998 guidelines. If you look at the power density, these are the same from 1998 and 2019, with the only exception that in 1998 power density was already assessed as of a frequency of 10 MHz, and in the 2019 guidelines that starts only at 30 MHz. Finally, if you compare the 2019 with the 1998 and the 2010 guidelines, you can conclude that the biological rationale of the new guidelines.
That was some guy from ICNIRP, and you can see that video on the ICNIRP website. Very interesting video. Told a little bit more than even I thought about the thermal effects of 5G and of course 4G. Anything sub 6 GHz, which is what you see at the moment in towns and villages, that applies to you, to everything that's going around you. But anything over 6 GHz is something completely different. So I got an email back from Cornerstone in addition to this just recently. Cornerstone do masts for Vodafone and O2. I'll just give you a little bit, which is really important, I think, of what this email said. It says, as one moves away from a mobile phone base station, a cabinet I suppose, on the mast, the strength of the radio wave falls off very rapidly, and as the strength decreases, so does the radio frequency exposure level. Closer to the antennas, there is an area of volume where it is possible that ICNIRP guidelines for the public may be exceeded. This is known as the ICNIRP public zone, and measures are taken in the form of antenna positioning, signage, and physical barriers to prevent inadvertent access to this area by the public. The extent of the zone will vary from site to site and is dependent on power input distribution and radio frequency fields and the frequency range. That's very interesting, because there is no there is nothing around a base station. I think there's only one, and that's behind Sale West estate in a bit of woodland. It's an EE mast. I've not seen anything like any fencing or anything like that, so people can not walk anywhere near a mast. What about all the masts that are going up near people's homes, right on top of them? So what about them people? So do you see where I'm coming from? It's quite scary. People are going to have to wake up to this, and we've got to stop this as soon as we possibly can. It's really, really bad, this 5G thing, and of course 4G, but it's done differently. This is the thing. 5G is beamed. It's totally different, and it's more at you. So take it from me. Just watch that video, understand it, and the information I've just received from Cornerstone, and of course you can see Cornerstone a little bit in the applications that you see, saying that you cannot inadvertently go anywhere near a mast. You can go really near a mast. Everyone goes next to a bleeding mast. Fucking masts are going up everywhere, right next to people's homes. What about them people? Do you see where I'm coming from? It's there. Look, listen to what I'm saying. It's there. It's pretty bloody obvious. This is not good, is it? I'm not making this up. This is really what's happening. We've got to wake up. Everyone's got to wake up now, and get the councillors to wake up, because they think it's perfectly acceptable. It certainly isn't. They have not understood this. Now perhaps they will. This is a very good video, and again, it's all official information and on the website, so they can learn a little bit more about radio frequencies. When we say 5G, it's sort of, it's just mobile phones. We've got to stop saying this. We've got to say frequencies. It's not the mobile. It's not just the mobile phone thing and the speeds that you're supposed to be able to do. It's the frequencies that people do not understand. We need to get that home to people. and that is what this video is all about. So that is that for now. Thank you very much for watching this video. Thanks to ICNIRP for that video as well. That's the there's no copyright. I didn't see any copyright thing on there, but I'll give them a credit as well for doing that really good video, I have to say, and it deserved an outing for people to understand what really is going on. Of course, it's a minefield. It's a very technical thing, but I think that really does show that 5G frequencies is really bad. See ya, bye.